The 4th of January 1912. On this day the moon was closer to Earth than it had been in 1,400 years. No one noticed. No newspaper reported it. No astronomer gazing at the stars on that cold winter night felt anything unusual. The moon simply hung there, a bit larger than usual, a bit brighter, like a giant eye watching the bustle and clamour of the human world. But in places unseen, gravity was undergoing subtle changes. The Sun, Earth, and Moon, three celestial bodies, aligned along the same straight line. This astronomical phenomenon wasn't rare, but when it coincided with the moon's perigee, the tidal forces became extraordinarily powerful. Seawater was pulled, rising, then falling. On the west coast of Greenland, icebergs that should have remained frozen to glaciers during winter began to loosen. They broke away from their parent bodies, slowly sliding into the Atlantic, as if pushed by some invisible hand drifting southward. These icebergs should have melted or shattered in more northern waters, but in the winter of 1912 ocean currents shifted subtly. The icebergs were carried to a place they shouldn't have been, latitude 42 degrees north, where the water temperature was warm enough to keep them alive, yet not warm enough to make them disappear. They waited there, waiting for a ship. 1909. Belfast, this port city in northeastern Ireland, was the heart of the shipbuilding industry in those days. In the docks of Harland and Wolff shipyard, the hammering of workers echoed from dawn to dusk. They were building a symbol of an era, a liner called Unsinkable, Titanic. The name comes from the Titans of Greek mythology, those giants who ruled the world before the gods. Its hull was 269 meters long, 28 meters wide, and 53 meters tall, the distance from keel to funnel, top equivalent to an 11-story building. Its displacement exceeded 46,000 tons, making it the largest moving object in the world at the time. Designer Thomas Andrews sketched out a structure of 16 watertight compartments on his blueprints. He had calculated that even if 4 compartments flooded simultaneously, the ship could still sail safely. It was a perfect design, at least in theory, but the ship's owner Ismay had his own ideas. He wanted more spacious decks, more luxurious first-class cabins, higher ceilings, so the bulkheads in the middle section were lowered in height. The number of lifeboats was reduced from 48 to 20. This way the deck looked more open, better suited for strolling and socializing. No one objected to these changes, because this ship simply could not sink. The 14th of April, 1912, 10 p.m., the surface of the Atlantic was like a vast sheet of black silk, spread flat beneath the starry sky. No wind, no waves. Not even the cry of seagulls could be heard. This kind of calm seemed ominous to the sailors. They preferred nights with wind and waves, because at least then they could hear the sound of icebergs striking the water. But tonight, there was no sound at all. Titanic was sailing west at 22.5 knots. This was her maiden voyage departing from Southampton, calling at Cherbourg and Queenstown, with New York as the final destination. There were 235 people on board, including some of the wealthiest people in the world, as well as poor immigrants carrying the American dream. In the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were on watch. They wore heavy coats, but the cold wind still crept in through their collars and cuffs. Fleet's eyes ached from the cold sea wind, and he kept blinking, trying to keep his vision clear. They had no binoculars. Those binoculars should have been there. They had been locked in some cabinet by Second Officer Blair, but Blair was reassigned from Titanic at the last moment, and he forgot to tell anyone where the key was. So Fleet could only use his naked eyes, searching for any unusual shapes in the darkness. After 10 p.m. the temperature began to drop. The seawater temperature was -2 degrees Celsius, and the air temperature was also approaching freezing point. This meant there were icebergs nearby. Captain Smith had received at least 6 iceberg warnings from other ships, but he didn't slow down, because tonight the sea was too calm, so calm that it felt like nothing dangerous could happen. At 11:40 p.m. Fleet saw it. At first, it was just a vague, dark shape on the horizon, like a deeper patch of darkness within the night. But as the Titanic drew closer, that dark shape began to reveal its outline, massive, irregular, like a floating mountain. Fleet's heart stopped beating in that instant. He grabbed the phone and shouted in the calmest voice he could manage, "Iceberg right ahead." A polite response came from the other end of the phone. "Thank you." Then time began to slow down. Fleet watched as the iceberg grew closer and closer, larger and larger. He could see the texture on the iceberg's surface, those ice crystals glittering in the moonlight, those blue cracks flickering in and out of view beneath the seawater. He knew that the part below the waterline was much larger than the part above. 450 meters, this was the distance between the Titanic and the iceberg. At a speed of 22.5 knots, this distance could be covered in just 39 seconds. In the wheelhouse, First Officer William Murdoch gave the order, "Hard a port, full astern." This was an instinctive reaction and a fatal mistake. If he had chosen to go straight ahead, the sturdy bow would have hit the iceberg, people would have been injured, some might even have died, but the ship wouldn't sink. If he had only turned hard to port without reversing, the Titanic could have completely avoided the iceberg in 37 seconds. But he chose to do both. So the Titanic began to turn, but not fast enough. Its hull scraped against the iceberg, producing a low, almost inaudible grinding sound. 5 to 7 meters below the waterline, the sharp edge of the iceberg sliced open the hull, 6 breaches, and seawater began to pour in. The total area of the water entry points was no more than 1.2 square meters, about the size of a small writing desk. 11:45 p.m. the ship stopped. This was the first thing many passengers noticed. Over the past few days, they had grown accustomed to the vibration of the hull, accustomed to the roar of the engines, accustomed to the sound of waves slapping against the ship. Now, all of that was gone. Silence, like an invisible net, enveloped the entire ship deep in the ship's hold. Chief Engineer Thomas Andrews was inspecting the damage. He passed through one watertight compartment after another, watching seawater surge through the cracks, watching the water level rise at a visible pace. His face grew paler and paler. 5 watertight compartments were flooding. He calculated in his mind. The Titanic was designed to withstand flooding in 4 compartments. But 5. This meant seawater would start from the bow, gradually spreading backward, eventually filling the entire ship. He looked at his watch. At the current rate of flooding, the ship could hold out for 160 minutes, less than 3 hours. Andrews walked up the stairs to find Captain Smith. His steps were slow, because he knew what he was about to announce was an unchangeable verdict. On the deck, passengers were still chatting and laughing. Some were kicking ice chunks, some were complaining about the cold, some were guessing why the ship had stopped. A lady from Philadelphia asked her husband, "When do you think we'll continue sailing?" Her husband laughed and said, "Soon, dear, maybe just a minor malfunction." He didn't know they only had 160 minutes left, 23:40, the giant's fingers at the moment of impact. Most people on the Titanic didn't feel much of anything. In the first-class smoking room, Colonel Astor was discussing the stock market with several gentlemen. They felt a slight tremor, like someone had moved a heavy piece of furniture in the next room. Astor paused for a moment, then continued his topic about the steel industry. Irish immigrants were still dancing jigs. The music drowned out any unusual sounds. Only a few people near the ship's wall noticed the picture frames on the wall swayed slightly. But at the very bottom of the ship, in the boiler rooms and engine rooms, the situation was completely different. Fireman Frederick Barrett was working in boiler room number 6. He heard a strange sound, not the crash of metal, but more like something enormous slowly sliding along the outside of the hull. It was as if an invisible giant was gently running its fingers along the side of the Titanic. Then, seawater began to pour in. At first it was just a thin stream, seeping through the gaps between the rivets in the ship's wall. Barrett thought a pipe had burst, and he bent down to take a look, but the flow grew larger and more urgent. Suddenly, the entire wall seemed to be leaking, seawater cascading down like a waterfall. Barrett shouted and jumped back. His colleagues also noticed something was wrong. The floor of the boiler room was starting to flood, and those usually dry corners were now glistening with water. "Close the watertight doors," someone shouted. The heavy steel doors began to slowly descend, sealing off the flooding compartment from the other areas. But Barrett knew this was only a temporary measure. He could hear the water surging on the other side of the door, like some trapped beast, roaring. 11:45 p.m. On the upper decks of the ship, Chef Charles Joffin was preparing tomorrow's breakfast. He had just taken a tray of fresh bread out of the oven, the golden crust still giving off steam. When the collision occurred, Jokin felt the hull shudder slightly. The tray in his hands tilted, and several loaves of bread rolled onto the floor. "Damn," he muttered, bending down to pick up the bread. That is when he noticed something strange. The floor no longer seemed level. The bread had all rolled in the same direction. Toward the bow. At first he thought it was his imagination, but when he placed an apple on the counter, it too began to slowly roll. The ship was tilting, just a slight tilt, barely noticeable. But for a chef who had worked at sea for 20 years, this change was obvious. Jochen set down his work and walked to the porthole to look outside. The sea was still calm as a mirror, starlight glittering on the water's surface. Everything looked normal, but he knew something was wrong. 11:50 p.m. in boiler room number 5. A group of stokers were celebrating. When word came that the watertight doors had closed, they thought it meant work was over. In their view, this was just a minor incident. Maybe they'd hit some floating debris, or there was a mechanical malfunction. Either way, it meant they could get off work early. "Back to Belfast," a young stoker shouted. The others cheered along. They thought the ship would return to port for repairs, which meant they could go home to see their families. But Foreman John Hip's expression was grave. He had just received an order from the engine room: maintain steam pressure, be ready to start the pumps at any moment. This didn't seem like an ordinary malfunction. "Quiet down, lads," Hip said. "I don't think this is that simple." But the young workers didn't want to hear it. They had already started planning what to do when they got back to Belfast, which pub to celebrate at, what gifts to buy for their girlfriends. In their imagination, this incident was just a minor episode, an interesting experience to brag about at the bar. They didn't know that at this very moment, seawater was pouring into the hull at a rate of 7 tons per minute. 20 minutes after the collision, some passengers began gathering on deck, not out of panic, but out of curiosity. The ship had stopped, which was a rare occurrence at sea. Moreover, some strange things had appeared on deck: ice chunks. These ice chunks varied in size, some like fists, some like footballs, scattered across various corners of the deck. They sparkled under the moonlight, like diamonds fallen from the sky. "Look at this," a businessman from New York shouted excitedly. He picked up a piece of ice and held it above his head. This must have fallen off the iceberg. Soon 20 or 30 people had gathered on deck. They treated the ice chunks as souvenirs, and some even started playing football with them. Laughter and cheers echoed in the cold night sky like an impromptu party. A little boy asked his father, "Dad, did we hit an iceberg?" "Yes, son," the father answered with a smile, "but don't worry, this ship is unsinkable." What they didn't know was that just a few dozen meters beneath their feet, seawater was rising relentlessly. 005 deep within the ship, a silent disaster was unfolding in the mailroom. 5 postal clerks, John Smith, Oscar Woody, William Logan Gwynn, Edwin Parker, and James Bertram Williamson, were racing against time. Seawater had already flooded into the mailroom, with over 200 bags of mail soaking in knee-deep freezing water. These letters contained the hopes and dreams of countless people: love letters, business contracts, family photos, immigration documents. Now, they were all slowly being swallowed by the sea. "Move the mail to the upper deck," Smith shouted. The 5 men began working frantically. They waded into the compartment, carrying the mail bags one by one. The seawater was bone-chillingly cold and quickly soaked through their clothes and boots. But they didn't stop, because this was their duty. Woody held a bag of letters from Ireland, which might contain the last letter some immigrant wrote to his mother back home. Parker carried a box of business documents that might determine some family's livelihood. Williamson cradled a bundle of packages in his arms, which might be a birthday gift some child had been eagerly waiting for. But the seawater was rising too fast. By the time they were moving the 3rd batch of mail, the water level had reached their waists. When they tried to move the 4th batch, the entire mailroom was submerged. Smith was the last to leave the mailroom. He looked back at the mailbags sinking in the water, his heart filled with guilt and helplessness. Those letters, those papers carrying people's emotions, had now become part of the Atlantic. 005, Andrew's verdict in the captain's quarters, a conversation that would change history, was taking place. Thomas Andrews stood before Captain Edward Smith, his face pale as paper. As the designer of the Titanic, he understood the ship's structure and limits better than anyone. "Captain," Andrew's voice was soft, but every word was clearly audible. "I must tell you a fact." Captain Smith looked at him, waiting for the bad news he had already sensed was coming. "The front 5 watertight compartments are all taking on water," Andrews continued. "At the current rate of flooding, the bow will become heavier and heavier, and seawater will overflow from one compartment to another. This is an irreversible process." The room fell into silence. Only the distant sounds of machinery and people talking could be heard. "How long do we have?" Smith asked. Andrews looked at his pocket watch and calculated again in his mind. An hour, maybe an hour and a half. He paused, then added, "Captain, this ship is going to sink." The words echoed in the room like some kind of spell. Captain Smith had sailed the seas for 40 years, weathering countless storms and dangers, but he had never faced a situation like this. "Are you certain?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I am certain," Andrews replied. "This is mathematics, not guesswork." Captain Smith walked to the porthole and gazed at the calm sea. In the distance, he could see the lights of other ships, but they were all too far away, far too far. "Then we'd better start evacuating the passengers," he said. But even at this moment, neither of them fully grasped the scale of the tragedy about to unfold. There were 2235 people on board, but the lifeboats could only hold 1178. This meant that no matter what, over 1,000 people would not be saved. This cruel mathematical equation had not yet been calculated by anyone. 0, 10, 30 minutes had passed since the collision. In this brief half-hour, the Titanic had transformed from an unsinkable luxury liner into a steel giant slowly dying. But most people on board didn't know this yet. In the first-class lounge, ladies were still chatting about Parisian fashion and the New York social season. In the second-class library, passengers were still reading quietly. In the third-class common areas, immigrants were still planning their new lives after arriving in America. Only a few people knew the truth: the captain, the designer, a few senior officers, and those workers fighting against the seawater deep in the ship's hold. The seawater continued to rise. Every minute, every second, the Titanic was becoming heavier, more unstable. The angle of the bow's tilt was slowly increasing. Though still slight for now, this change was irreversible. At this moment, there were still 130 minutes until the final sinking. 130 minutes for a normal night is just a short period of time. Enough to finish watching a movie, enough to have a leisurely dinner, enough to take a train from London to Brighton. But for the 2235 people on the Titanic, these 130 minutes would determine their life or death. Time suddenly became heavy. It was no longer just numbers passing calmly on a clock face, but had become something tangible, something whose weight could be felt. Every minute was like a stone pressing down on everyone's heart. Though most of them didn't know this yet, 12:15 a.m. When Captain Smith gave the evacuation order, he used very restrained wording. "Would all passengers please put on your life jackets and assemble on deck? This is just a precautionary measure." Precautionary measures, this phrase, carried special weight in that era. It meant there was no real danger, just acting with caution. It meant everything was under control, just following procedures. So when the crew began knocking on doors to notify passengers, they used the same gentle tone. "Sir, madam, please put on your life jackets. Now." "Yes, sir, captain's orders." "But we were just about to sleep." "I understand, sir, but this is a necessary procedure." In the first-class corridors, such conversations were being repeated. Passengers rose from their warm beds with confusion and mild displeasure and began putting on those bulky life jackets. The life jackets were made of cork and canvas, stiff and uncomfortable to wear. Many ladies complained that they ruined the lines of their carefully chosen evening gowns. A lady from Philadelphia even refused to wear a life jacket because "it makes me look like a washerwoman." But most people still complied with the instructions, not out of fear but out of politeness. In that era, gentlemen and ladies were taught to respect authority, to follow rules even when those rules seemed pointless. 0:20 Preparation of the lifeboats on deck. The crew began preparing the lifeboats. This was a task they had never truly practiced. Before Titanic's maiden voyage, there had been only one lifeboat drill, and only 2 boats were lowered. No one knew how to quickly and efficiently lower all 20 lifeboats. No one knew how to operate those complex pulley systems in the dark. Worse still, many crew members didn't even know which lifeboat they had been assigned to. When boarding at Southampton due to a coal workers' strike, the White Star Line had temporarily transferred a large number of crew from other ships. These men were unfamiliar with Titanic's layout and knew little about emergency procedures. 5th Officer Lowe stood beside lifeboat number 7, looking at those complex ropes and pulleys, feeling a wave of dizziness. He had worked at sea for 15 years, but had never actually used a lifeboat throughout his career. Lifeboats had always been just decorations on deck, equipment required by insurance companies, but never actually put to use. Now, he had to learn how to use them in the dark, in the cold, under the pressure of time. He began untying the ropes securing the lifeboat. The ropes had become stiff from long exposure to sea wind, and the knots were difficult to undo. His fingers grew clumsy in the cold, and several times he nearly broke the rope. Other crew members were doing the same work. They ran back and forth on the deck, moving equipment, checking pulleys, trying to remember the steps they had learned in training. But everything was going slowly, chaotically, because no one really believed these lifeboats would ever be used. 025, the distress call from the radio room on the upper deck of the ship. A race against time was underway in the radio room. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, the two radio operators, sat at their equipment, fingers tapping rapidly on the telegraph keys. The clicking of Morse code echoed in the cramped room like some kind of frantic heartbeat. CQD, CQD, this was the international distress signal at the time. Phillips sent this signal over and over again, while reporting Titanic's position, 41 degrees 46 north, 50 degrees 14 west. At first, there was no response. The Atlantic night was quiet, radio waves traveling through the air, but no one seemed to be listening. Phillips felt a wave of despair. Was there no ship nearby at all? Then, at 025, he received the first response. Received your CQD. We are coming at full speed, 58 nautical miles from you. It was the Carpathia, a passenger liner bound for the Mediterranean. Its captain, Arthur Rostron, immediately ordered a change of course, heading at full speed toward Titanic's position. 58 nautical miles. At Carpathia's top speed of 14 knots, it would take 4 hours to arrive. Phillips glanced at the clock on the wall. It was now 025. If the Carpathia could arrive within 4 hours, that would be 4:25 in the morning. But Andrews said the ship could only hold on for another hour and a half. That meant by the time rescue arrived, the Titanic would have been sunk for nearly 3 hours. Phillips didn't tell anyone about this calculation. He just kept tapping the telegraph key, continuing to send distress signals, hoping a closer ship might hear. CQD, CQD, tick, tick. 030. Less than 20 nautical miles from the Titanic, there was a ship, the Californian. It was a cargo ship sailing from London to Boston, carrying blankets, clothing, and other goods. Its captain, Stanley Lord, was a cautious man. When he saw a large amount of floating ice in the waters ahead, he decided to stop the ship for the night and wait until dawn to continue. It was a wise decision, but it also meant that the Californian was now sitting quietly on the sea, less than an hour's voyage from the sinking Titanic. The Californian had only one wireless operator, Cyril Evans. According to the regulations at the time, wireless operators on cargo ships were not required to be on duty 24 hours. Evans' working hours were from 7 in the morning to 11 at night. At 11:30 p.m., Evans shut down the wireless equipment, took off his headphones, and prepared for bed. Before shutting down, he had tried to contact the Titanic to warn them about ice ahead, but the Titanic's wireless operator Phillips was busy sending passengers private telegrams, and he impatiently replied, "Shut up, you are jamming my signal." Evans shrugged and shut down the equipment. He didn't know that just 10 minutes after he powered off, the Titanic struck an iceberg. Now, as Phillips was desperately sending distress signals, the wireless room of the Californian was silent. The equipment had been shut down, and Evans was sound asleep in his bunk. But on the deck of the Californian, Second Officer Herbert Stone on watch saw something strange. On the southern horizon, there were lights from a ship. That ship seemed to be stopped there, its lights flickering as if sending some kind of signal. Stone picked up his binoculars to observe carefully, and he saw that the ship appeared to be firing rockets. White rockets blooming in the night sky, then slowly falling. Stone felt puzzled. Rockets were usually distress signals, but that ship didn't appear to be in danger. Its lights were steady, and the hull wasn't listing. Perhaps, Stone thought, it was just some kind of celebration, maybe greeting other ships. He reported this observation to Captain Lord. Lord was resting in the captain's quarters, and upon hearing the report, he said, "Keep watching. If there are any changes, notify me immediately." Then he turned over and went back to sleep. Just like that, the Californian continued to sit quietly on the sea, less than 20 nautical miles from the Titanic, yet took no action. 035. In the first-class lounge, bandleader Wallace Hartley was gathering his musicians. There were 2 bands on the Titanic, a 5-piece band for first-class entertainment and a 3-piece band for second class. Now Hartley decided to merge the 2 bands and play on deck to calm the passengers' nerves. 8 people, 8 instruments, 2 violins, 1 viola, 1 cello, 1 double bass, 1 piano. But the piano was too heavy to move onto the deck. one clarinet, one flute. They wore neat uniforms with bow ties, just like when they played in the lounge. Hartley insisted on maintaining a professional image even under these circumstances. "What do we play?" asked the young cellist Roger Brickou. Hartley thought for a moment. "Upbeat tunes, waltzes, ragtime, music that makes people feel happy." So at 0:40, when the first passengers began gathering on deck, they heard music, upbeat, elegant music, with an unreal sense of joy. The band stood near the entrance to first class, playing in the cold night wind. Their fingers quickly went numb, and their breath condensed into white mist in the air. But they didn't stop. The music echoed across the deck, mixing with the sound of waves, the roar of machinery, and people's conversations, creating a surreal atmosphere. It was as if this wasn't a disaster, but a late-night deck party. A first-class lady said to her husband, "Look, they're still playing music. That means everything is fine, doesn't it?" Her husband nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the distant horizon, where there was nothing but endless darkness. 0:45. Lifeboat number 7 was the first to be lowered. This boat could hold 65 people, but when it left the Titanic, there were only 28 people on it. Why? Because no one wanted to get on. At that moment, the Titanic still looked like the safest place. It was huge, solid, brightly lit, with heating, music, and food. And the lifeboat, it was just a small wooden container hanging above the dark sea, swaying, looking like it could capsize at any moment. "Ladies, please board the boat," First Officer Murdoch said politely, but the ladies hesitated. They looked at the small boat, looked at the dark water below, and felt a wave of fear. "Do we have to leave this ship?" a lady asked. "It is just a precaution, ma'am," Murdoch replied. "You'll be back soon." These words were both comfort and a lie. Murdoch knew the Titanic was sinking, but he couldn't say it. If he told the truth, it might cause panic, so he could only use this gentle approach, trying to persuade people to board the lifeboats. Eventually, some ladies got on the boat after their husband's persuasion. They carefully stepped over the railing and sat in the lifeboat with the crew's help. Their evening gowns fluttered in the cold wind, jewelry sparkling in the moonlight. As the lifeboat began to descend, they waved goodbye to their husbands on the deck. "I'll be back soon," a lady shouted. "Take care of yourself," her husband responded. They all thought this was just a brief separation. They didn't know this was a final farewell. The lifeboat slowly descended, the pulleys making creaking sounds. During the descent, the boat bumped against the hull several times, making dull thudding sounds. The ladies sitting in the boat gripped their seats tightly, closed their eyes, and prayed for this to be over soon. When the lifeboat finally touched the sea surface, they felt a slight jolt. Then the crew began rowing, paddling the small boat away from the Titanic. In the boat, the ladies looked back at the giant ship. It was still brilliantly lit, like a floating palace. Music was still playing, people were still moving about on the deck. Everything looked so normal, so safe. "Why did we have to leave?" a lady asked, confused. No one answered her, because no one knew the answer, or rather, no one wanted to say the answer. At 0:50 on the lower decks of the ship, the third-class passengers still didn't know what had happened. No one came to knock on their doors. No one told them to put on life jackets. No one guided them to the deck. They only felt the ship had stopped, heard some strange sounds, but didn't know what it meant. Some people stepped out of their cabins trying to figure out what had happened. They wandered in the corridors asking each other, but couldn't get any answers. Maybe the engines broke down. Maybe we hit something. Maybe we're going back to port. Their guesses were all reasonable, but none were the truth. The layout of third class was complicated, like a maze. The corridors were narrow and winding, the stairs steep and hard to climb. Everywhere there were locked doors and gates. These barriers were meant to prevent third-class passengers from accidentally wandering into first-class areas. In those days, class boundaries had to be strictly maintained, even at sea. A group of Irish immigrants tried to find their way to the deck. They climbed a staircase, only to find a locked door at the end. They knocked and shouted, but no one answered. So they turned back, trying to find another way. But the ship's interior was too complex. Every corridor looked the same. Every staircase seemed to lead to the same place. They went in circles through the maze, growing more anxious, more confused. A little girl began to cry. Her mother held her, comforting her softly in Gaelic. But the mother herself was trembling, not knowing which way to go. At that moment, on the deck above their heads, lifeboats were being lowered one after another. But on these lifeboats, there were hardly any third-class passengers. It wasn't because of discrimination, at least not entirely. It was because something went wrong with the flow of information. No one told the third-class passengers what to do. No one guided them to the right place. They were forgotten. 1 a.m. 80 minutes after the collision, the Titanic's tilt began to become noticeable. At first, the tilt was so slight that only the most sensitive people could detect it. But now, even the most oblivious could feel it. In the dining room, wine glasses on the tables began to slowly slide. In the corridors, picture frames on the walls began to tilt. In the cabins, wardrobe doors opened by themselves, and the clothes inside slid onto the floor. The laws of physics began to show their power. The bow was getting heavier and heavier, the stern lighter and lighter. This imbalance was slowly intensifying like some unstoppable trend. On the deck, people began to notice this change. Walking became a bit difficult, requiring slight adjustments to their center of gravity. When standing still, they felt their bodies involuntarily leaning forward. "The ship is sinking," someone said softly. This sentence spread through the crowd like a cold wind. The ship is sinking. The ship is sinking. The ship is sinking. But even at this moment, many people still refused to believe it, because the Titanic still looked so massive, so solid. Its funnels were still smoking, its lights were still shining, its band was still playing. "How could it possibly sink?" a gentleman said to his wife. "Darling, this is only temporary. The engineers will fix it." But his voice no longer held the confidence it had before. 1:10. 90 minutes had passed since the collision. In those 90 minutes, the Titanic had transformed from an impossible miracle into an inevitable tragedy. But this transformation was so slow, so gradual, that many people hadn't fully realized it yet. They were still waiting, still hoping, still believing that some miracle would happen. Maybe a ship would come to rescue them. Maybe the engineers would find a way to stop the flooding. Maybe all of this was just a nightmare, and they would wake up soon. But time would not stop. Every minute, every second, the seawater continued to rise. Every minute, every second, the bow continued to sink. It was a mathematical process, a physical process, an irreversible process. At this moment, there were still 100 minutes until the final sinking. 100 minutes, this number flickered in the darkness, like some kind of countdown. 1:15 a.m., in the lower decks of the ship, the third-class passengers finally found their way to the deck. Not because someone came to guide them, but because they broke through the barriers themselves. A group of Irish men rammed open a locked door with their shoulders. The wood made a cracking sound. The door frame shattered, and the door finally opened. "Quick, this way," someone shouted in Gaelic. People began to surge toward this exit. Men, women, children, they pushed and shoved, desperately trying to reach the deck. But when they finally climbed the stairs and reached the deck, the sight before them left them stunned. Most of the lifeboats were already gone. There were still many people on deck, but the number of lifeboats was rapidly decreasing. Some boats were already on the water, rowing away from the Titanic. Some boats were being lowered, the pulleys making creaking sounds. "We're too late," a man said softly. He spoke in English, but the despair in his tone was universal. The third-class passengers stood on the deck, watching the scene before them. Many of them were immigrants, carrying all their belongings, boarding this ship with dreams of a new world. Now, that dream was sinking. A young mother held her baby, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know where to go, didn't know what to do. She just stood there, trembling in the cold wind, clutching her child tightly. A crew member saw her and walked over. "Ma'am, please come with me." He led her toward a lifeboat that hadn't been lowered yet. It was a small act of kindness, a bit of humanity amid the chaos. But for most of the third-class passengers, it was already too late. 1:20. The captain's final walk. Captain Edward Smith walked slowly across the deck. He was already 68 years old, and this was his last voyage. It was supposed to be a glorious retirement trip. Now, it had become something else. He walked past groups of passengers, past busy crew members, past the band still playing. His face showed no expression, but there was a profound sadness in his eyes. This was his ship, his responsibility. His failure. Some said he should have ordered an evacuation immediately after the collision. Some said he should have recognized the danger sooner. Some said he should have slowed down and avoided the iceberg. But all these should haves meant nothing now. Smith walked to the bridge and looked at the sea ahead. The bow had noticeably sunk, and seawater was slowly creeping up the forward deck. The angle of tilt was increasing, from an almost imperceptible lean at first to an obvious sinking now. He looked at his watch. 1:20, 100 minutes had passed since the collision. He recalled Andrew's prediction. The ship could only hold out for another hour and a half. Now, most of that time had already passed. Smith turned and looked at his ship. Titanic was still brilliantly lit, like a floating palace, but it was dying slowly and inevitably dying. He wanted to say something but didn't know what to say. He wanted to do something but didn't know what to do. So he just stood there watching it all happen. 1:25 a.m. beside the lifeboats, scenes of farewell were unfolding. Women and children first. That was the rule at the time, a kind of Victorian chivalry. Men had to stay behind, letting women and children go first. For some, it was an honor. For others, it was torture. John Jacob Astor Fife, one of the richest men in America, stood beside lifeboat number 4. His wife Madeleine was pregnant, only 18 years old. "May I accompany my wife onto the boat?" Astor asked. "She is in a delicate condition." Second Officer Lightoller shook his head. "I am sorry, sir, women and children only." Astor nodded. He helped Madeleine into the boat, making sure she was seated securely. Then he stepped back. "Take care of yourself," he said. "I'll be on the next boat." It was a lie. They both knew it was a lie. But it was a necessary lie, a lie that made the farewell bearable. Madeleine looked at her husband, tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to say something, but her throat choked up. The lifeboat began to descend. Astor stood by the railing, waving down. His face wore a smile, a gentle, sad smile. When the lifeboat touched the sea, Madeleine looked back at the Titanic. She saw her husband still standing there in the lights, a lonely figure. Then the lifeboat began to row away, and that figure grew smaller and smaller, more and more blurred until it finally disappeared into the night. 1:30 a.m. In the chaos, class boundaries began to blur but didn't completely disappear. On the first-class deck, the gentlemen still maintained their courtesy. They helped the ladies onto the lifeboats. They gave up their own spots. They stood in the cold wind as if attending some formal ceremony. Benjamin Guggenheim, an American industrialist, changed into his finest evening dress. "If I am going to sink to the bottom of the sea," he told his valet, "I am going to go down like a gentleman." He stood on the deck with his secretary, dressed in neat tailcoats, wearing bow ties, as if they were going to attend a dinner party. "We've done our best," Guggenheim said. "Now let's face the end like men." It was a performance, a way to maintain dignity in the face of death. It might seem absurd, but in that moment it gave them something, a sense of control, a way to preserve their identity amid the chaos. But in the third-class areas things were completely different. There was no polite queuing, no elegant farewells. People were pushing, scrambling, desperately searching for any possible chance of escape. Some tried to climb onto already full lifeboats. Some were looking for life jackets. Some just stood there, paralyzed by fear. The crew tried to maintain order, but there were too few of them. Some crew members began using force. They brandished pistols, firing shots into the air, trying to stop people from rushing the lifeboats. The gunshots echoed through the night sky, like some terrible punctuation mark. 1:35 a.m. At this moment, on the Titanic, everyone could feel the weight of time. Not abstract time, not numbers on a clock, but concrete, physical time. The speed at which the bow was sinking, the speed at which the seawater was rising, the speed at which the lifeboats were leaving. The tilt of the ship was now very obvious. Walking required holding onto railings, standing required adjusting your center of gravity. Some unsecured items began to slide, chairs, tables, suitcases, gliding across the deck, making dull, crashing sounds. Inside the ship, things were worse. Corridors had become slopes. Stairs had become difficult to climb. Some cabin doors could no longer be opened because the tilt had changed the shape of the door frames. In the boiler room, the engineers were still working. They knew the ship was sinking, but they continued to maintain steam pressure, continued to keep the lights on, because as long as the lights were still on, people still had hope. As long as the machines were still running, there was still time to evacuate. They stood in waist-deep seawater, amid steam and heat, continuing to work. They knew they wouldn't be rescued. The boiler room was at the very bottom of the ship, and when the ship sank, they would be the first to be submerged. But they kept working because it was their duty, because it was what they could do. 1:40 a.m. Collapsible lifeboat C was one of the last boats to be lowered. It was a special boat. Its sides were made of canvas and could be folded up to save space. Now, the crew was hurriedly unfolding it, preparing to lower it. The crowd began surging toward this boat. Everyone realized that there weren't many lifeboats left. This might be the last chance. Second Officer Lightoller stood by the boat, trying to maintain order. "Women and children," he shouted. "Only women and children." But the crowd wouldn't listen. Men began pushing and shoving, trying to force their way onto the lifeboats. Panic finally erupted. The kind of panic that had been suppressed for over an hour, now surging out like a flood. Lightoller drew his pistol. "Get back," he shouted, "or I'll shoot." The crowd hesitated. In that brief pause, some women and children were pushed onto the lifeboat. Then Lightoller saw a little boy standing in the crowd, being shoved around, his eyes filled with fear. "You, come here," Lightoller said. The boy hesitated. "Hurry," the boy ran over, and Lightoller picked him up and placed him in the lifeboat. "Take care of him," he said to the ladies in the boat. Then he turned around and continued maintaining order. The lifeboat began to descend. Inside the boat, people looked back at the Titanic. Its tilt was now very obvious, the bow almost touching the sea, the stern rising high. But its lights were still shining. On the dark sea, it was like a tilting lighthouse, illuminating the surrounding waters. 1:50 a.m. at this moment. There were 20 minutes left until the final sinking, but no one knew this number. No one knew how much time they had left. They only knew that time was slipping away. The ship was sinking, and they were still here. On the deck, people began moving toward the stern. Because the bow was sinking, the stern was relatively higher, relatively safer. This was an instinctive reaction, an instinct to flee from danger. But it was also futile. No matter where they moved, the final outcome would be the same. The band was still playing. They had moved from the middle of the ship to the stern, following the crowd. Hartley's fingers were already frozen, but he continued playing the violin. The music drifted through the night sky, like some kind of prayer, some kind of spell against the darkness. In the crowd, someone began to pray. Someone was crying, someone just stood there, numbly watching everything before them. Time was passing. Every second, more seawater poured into the hull. Every second, the bow sank deeper. Every second, the angle of tilt increased. This was an irreversible process, a mathematical inevitability, a law of physics. 20 minutes left. At 1:55 a.m. on the Titanic, a sound began to grow louder and louder. Not human voices, not music, not waves. It was the sound of metal. The hull was groaning. Steel was twisting. Rivets were snapping. It was a low, continuous moan like some enormous creature struggling in agony. The ship's tilt had now reached a critical point. The bow was completely submerged, the stern raised high, the entire ship like a giant lever slowly bending under the force of gravity. On the deck, people began to lose their balance. Walking became difficult. Standing required grabbing onto anything available. Railings, masts, chimneys. Some people began to slide, slipping uncontrollably toward the bow on the tilting deck. Objects began to move. Deck chairs, life rings, wooden crates. They slid across the deck, crashing into the railings with dull thuds. A piano slid out of the lounge, through the corridor, and finally smashed against a wall. Inside the ship, the situation was even more terrifying. Corridors became steep slopes. Stairs were nearly impossible to climb. Furniture in some cabins began to topple beds, wardrobes, dressers, sliding across rooms and piling up against the lower walls. Mirrors shattered. Porcelain broke. Crystal chandeliers swayed, making crisp tinkling sounds. This was a world physically falling apart. Gravity, that usually ignored force, had now become the master. It was speaking through the groaning of metal, the sliding of objects, the stumbling of people. It was saying, "This ship is going to break." 2 o'clock, at the very bottom of the ship, in places ordinary passengers would never see, a group of men were doing their final work. The boiler room was now mostly flooded with seawater. The water level had risen to chest height, freezing cold, but the engineers were still there. They were maintaining steam pressure. This might sound absurd. The ship is sinking, why keep the steam going? But there is a reason. Steam powers the generators. Generators provide electricity. Electricity keeps the lights on. As long as the lights are on, people on deck can still see. As long as the lights are on, lifeboats can still find their way. As long as the lights are on, there is still hope. So they kept working. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell stood in chest-deep water, checking the pressure gauges. There was no panic on his face, only focus. This was his duty, his profession, his dignity. "Keep the pressure steady," he told his team. "We can hold on a little longer." His voice was calm, like he was just working a regular night shift. But they all knew the truth. They wouldn't be leaving here when the ship went down. They would be the first to be submerged. But they didn't leave. A young engineer, barely in his early 20s, watched the rising water and asked, "Sir, when do we evacuate?" Bell glanced at him, a gentle sadness in his eyes. "We don't evacuate, son. Our job is to keep the lights on." The young man nodded. He understood. In that moment, in that flooded boiler room, there was a strange calm. These men knew their fate, but they chose to stay. Not because they were ordered to, but because it was their choice. This was a kind of professional dignity, a way of maintaining one's identity in the face of death. The water level continued to rise. The steam continued to hiss. The needle on the pressure gauge continued to tremble. The lights were still shining. 2:05 at this moment. Almost everyone still alive on the Titanic had gathered at the stern. Because the bow had completely submerged, the middle of the ship was also sinking rapidly. Only the stern remained relatively high. People instinctively climbed upward, moving toward what seemed like the safest place. The deck at the stern was packed with people. Over 1,000 people stood there, clutching railings, masts, anything they could hold on to. On their faces were fear, despair, numbness, a kind of waiting for the end that was about to come. The angle of tilt had now exceeded 30 degrees. Standing became almost impossible. Some people sat down, backs against the railings. Some knelt on the deck, praying. Some just stood there, staring into the darkness ahead. Among the crowd, there was still that band. Wallace Hartley and his musicians had been playing for nearly 2 hours. Their fingers were frozen stiff, their lips purple, but they hadn't stopped. Now, they began to play a new piece. "Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer, my God, to thee." It was a hymn, a song about the soul drawing closer to God. The melody was slow, solemn, filled with a kind of religious reverence. On the deck, people stopped moving, listening to the music. Some began to sing along. Their voices drifted in the cold wind, intertwining with the melody of the violin. "Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee." This wasn't a cheerful song. It wasn't meant to comfort or encourage. It was a song of farewell, a song of accepting fate. Hartley played the violin with his eyes closed. He knew this was the last time he would ever play. He knew that when this song ended, everything would end, but he kept playing because this was the last gift he could give, a bit of order in the chaos, a bit of beauty in the fear. The music rose into the night sky like some kind of prayer, drifting to those already in the lifeboats, to those floating on the dark sea, to those who would never know what happened on this night. At 2:10 a.m., among the crowd at the stern, there was a Catholic priest. Father Thomas Biles, 39 years old, was on his way to America for missionary work. He stood on the tilting deck, praying for the people around him. His voice was calm, carrying a profound certainty. "Lord, receive these souls, forgive them their sins, grant them peace." People gathered around him. There were Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and non-believers. But in that moment, none of these distinctions mattered. They just needed something, some words, some ritual, something to make this terrible moment bearable. Father Biles gave them collective absolution. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I absolve you of your sins." His hand traced a cross in the air around him. People knelt down, heads bowed, some crying, some praying, some just closing their eyes, waiting. It was a strange scene, on a sinking ship, on a tilting deck, on a cold night. A group of strangers gathered together for an impromptu religious ceremony, but it gave them something, a kind of dignity, a way to remain human in the face of death. Father Biles continued to pray. His voice drifted in the wind, mixing with the band's music, forming a strange harmony, the melody of violins and Latin prayers, music and words, art and faith. This is what humans can do when facing an inevitable end. Not escape, not denial, but creating meaning, using music, using prayer, using ritual, to fight against the void. 2:15. The hull begins to break apart at this moment. The Titanic was undergoing its final physical test. The bow had completely submerged, weighing thousands of tons. The stern rose high, about 50 meters out of the water. The entire ship was like a giant lever bearing unimaginable pressure at some point. In the middle, steel was not designed for this kind of stress. The hull of the Titanic was riveted together from thousands of steel plates. These rivets, each only a few centimeters long, were now bearing the weight of the entire ship. They began to snap. One by one, rivets popped from the steel plates, making crisp, cracking sounds. These sounds echoed through the night sky like some terrible countdown. Pop, pop, pop on deck. People heard these sounds. They didn't know what it was, but they could feel it. The ship was breaking apart. The groaning of the hull grew louder, no longer a low moan, but a sharp metallic scream. Steel was twisting, bending, reaching its limit. Then, in the middle of the ship, between the third and fourth funnels, a crack appeared. At first, it was just a thin line snaking across the steel plates, but it was expanding rapidly, like something alive crawling across the hull. The crack made a terrible sound, not an explosion, but a continuous tearing sound, like enormous fabric being ripped apart. Inside the ship, things were even more terrifying. Corridors were twisting, walls were bending, ceilings were splitting open, doors to some cabins suddenly burst open, furniture spilling out from within. On the grand staircase, that magnificent oak staircase, that once proud symbol of the Titanic, was now collapsing. Wood was snapping, railings were toppling, the glass dome was shattering. This was the end of a world. Not an abstract end, but a concrete, physical end. A world made of steel and wood was falling apart. 2:17. At this precise moment, the Titanic's hull completely broke apart. The crack extended from one side of the ship to the other, through all the decks, severing all connections. The hull broke in two at the middle. The process lasted only a few seconds, but for those on the ship, it felt like eternity. First came a tremendous cracking sound, like thunder, like the end of the world. Then the screaming of metal, the twisting of steel, the snapping of wood. The hull was separating. The bow section, already completely submerged, began to sink rapidly. It was like a massive stone pulled by gravity toward the deep sea. The stern section, having lost the weight of the bow, suddenly rebounded upward. It was like a giant seesaw swinging violently after losing its balance. On the stern deck, people were thrown into the air by this sudden movement. Some lost their grip, sliding off the deck, plunging into the dark seawater. Some clung tightly to the railings, but the railings were twisting, bending, breaking. Screams echoed through the night sky. Not screams of fear, but something more primal pain, despair, an instinctive defiance against death. The stern hung in the air for a few seconds, standing almost vertically above the sea. In that brief moment, it looked like a massive monument, a tombstone of steel standing in the dark ocean. Then it began to sink. 2:18, the stern was slowly sinking. Not a rapid plunge, but a slow, almost graceful descent. It lingered on the surface for a moment, as if hesitating, as if saying goodbye. On the deck of the stern, there were still hundreds of people. They clung tightly to anything they could hold on to, but nothing could save them. The ship was sinking. Gravity was speaking. The laws of physics could not be defied. Some chose to jump into the sea. They climbed over the railings, looked at the dark water below, then leaped. Their bodies traced arcs through the air, then vanished into the darkness. Some chose to stay on the ship. They sat on the deck, or stood there, calmly waiting. They knew what the end would be, and they accepted it. Wallace Hartley and his band were still playing. Even when the hull broke apart, even when the stern began to sink, they kept playing. The melody of the violin drifted through the night sky, like some final protest, defying everything that was happening. Then, the music stopped, not because they stopped playing, but because the seawater engulfed them. The stern was sinking. The seawater was rising, crawling up the deck inch by inch. It flooded people's feet, then their legs, then their waists, then their chests. Bone-chillingly cold. The seawater temperature was -2 degrees. When it touched the skin, it cut like a knife. It stole breath, stole the ability to think, stole everything. People began to lose consciousness, not from drowning, but from hypothermic shock. Their bodies couldn't withstand this cold. Their hearts stopped beating. Their brains stopped functioning. Death came quickly. At 2:19, in the final moments, as the stern sank, the lights were still shining. Those engineers working in the boiler rooms, those men who chose to stay behind to maintain steam pressure, they succeeded. Until the very last moment, the Titanic's lights were still shining. But now the seawater flooded the generators. The power cut out. The lights flickered once, then went out. The entire ship suddenly plunged into darkness. In that instant, in that moment when the lights went out, everything changed. Before, even in the chaos, even in the fear, the lights still gave people an illusion of hope. They made the Titanic still look like a ship, still like a civilized space. But now, in the darkness, it was just an object that was sinking. In the lifeboats, on the sea surface several hundred meters away, People watched this scene. They saw the lights of the Titanic suddenly go out, saw that massive ship suddenly disappear into the darkness. Only a blurry outline remained, a black shadow slowly sinking under the starlight. Some people began to cry. Some turned their heads away, unable to bear watching any longer. Some just sat there, numbly watching, unable to believe what was happening before their eyes. On the ship, in the darkness, people lost their last point of reference. They couldn't see each other, couldn't see the seawater, couldn't see anything. They could only feel the ship was sinking, the seawater was rising, the cold was creeping in. Then it was all over. 2:20 a.m. At this precise moment, the stern of the Titanic completely sank beneath the sea. There was no explosion, no tremendous sound, no dramatic ending. It just disappeared. Slowly, quietly, it slipped into the dark waters, vanishing into the depths of the Atlantic. On the surface, chaos remained. Hundreds of people struggled in the water. They wore life jackets, floating in the freezing seawater, but the life jackets couldn't protect them from the assault of the cold. They were screaming, calling for help, desperately swimming toward the lifeboats. But the lifeboats didn't dare come close. The crew were afraid if they got close, those people in the water would swarm them, would capsize the lifeboat, would drown everyone. So they rowed away. They rowed into the distance, away from those screams, away from those cries for help, away from those dying people. In the lifeboats, people sat there listening to those sounds. At first, it was hundreds of voices, a chaotic mix of screams and cries for help. Then, the sounds began to fade. One by one, those people in the water stopped screaming. Not because they were saved, but because they died. Hypothermic shock only takes 15 minutes. In seawater at -2 degrees, the human body cannot maintain its core temperature. The heart stops beating, the brain stops functioning, life ceases to exist. After 15 minutes, the sea surface was almost completely silent. Only the sound of waves remained, the sound of wind and the muffled sobs of people in the lifeboats. The Titanic was gone, those people on the ship were gone. Only the dark water remained, the cold night, and the lifeboats drifting under the starlight. 2:30 at this moment, in this stretch of the Atlantic, there was a profound silence. Not complete quiet, waves still lapped, wind still blew, people in the lifeboats still spoke in hushed voices. But there was a deeper silence, a silence that comes after a great disaster, a silence that comes after 1,500 people have died. In the lifeboats, people sat there, wrapped in blankets, huddling together for warmth. They didn't speak because there was nothing to say. They just sat there in the darkness, waiting for dawn. Some were crying. Some were praying. Some just stared ahead, eyes hollow, numbed by the shock of what had just happened. On the water's surface, various debris floated, planks, life rings, suitcases, chairs, and bodies wearing life jackets, floating in the water, face down, motionless. Moonlight shone on the sea, casting a silver glow over everything. In that light, the scene looked almost beautiful. The calm sea, the floating objects, the lifeboats under the starlight. But it was a terrible beauty, a beauty of death. In the lifeboats, someone began to count, counting how many boats there were, counting how many people were rescued, counting how many were missing. The numbers were cruel. 20 lifeboats, about 700 people rescued. That meant over 1,500 people had died. 1,500 lives gone in 2.5 hours. 1,500 stories, never to be told. 1,500 dreams, never to come true.